All right, folks, get ready for a wild ride because today we're taking a deep dive into the world of Grigory Rasputin. You know, the Siberian mystic who became BFFs with the Russian Tsar. We've got some incredible sources lined up for you, like writings from Rasputin himself, a pretty fiery account from monk Iliador, who actually knew him, and of course, some historical context to keep us grounded. You're curious how a devout Catholic should think about this guy, right? Especially with all talk of miracles, political manipulation, and whispers of some seriously dark stuff.
You're telling me. Rasputin's story is like something out of a movie. He was a Siberian peasant who somehow ended up right in the middle of the Russian imperial court.
It's crazy. Picture this. Russia in the early 1900s, total social unrest, political intrigue everywhere you look. That's the backdrop for Rasputin's rise to power. This guy claiming to be a healer and a spiritual guru.
Yeah, and don't forget his connection to Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. Their son, Alexei, had hemophilia, and they were desperate for a cure.
So that's where the miracles come in. Monk Iliador, in his book, talks about how Rasputin apparently stopped Alexei's bleeding. I mean, can you imagine? To the royal family, that must have seemed like proof that Rasputin was sent from God.
Totally. The Tsar and Tsarina were very religious, so that solidified Rasputin's position. But here's the twist. Monk Iliador went from Rasputin's biggest fan to his harshest critic. He started denouncing Rasputin's behavior and the power he had.
Okay, so what happened? What made Iliador turn against the man he once considered a spiritual mentor?
Well, Iliador became increasingly concerned about Rasputin's lifestyle and all the crazy rumors floating around, stories about his wild parties, manipulating people, maybe even heresy. Iliador even says the Holy Synod, the governing body of the Russian Orthodox Church, ordered him to go talk to Rasputin about his actions.
So what happened when they met? Did Rasputin deny everything?
According to Iliador, at first Rasputin promised to change his ways, but he didn't. And that just solidified Iliador's concerns. He was convinced that Rasputin wasn't the holy man he pretended to be.
That raises a big question for our listener who's trying to understand all of this from a Catholic point of view. Were these accusations just exaggerations made up by Rasputin's enemies, or was there something darker going on?
It's a question that requires some serious thought, especially when you consider all the scandalous stories about Rasputin. Iliador didn't hold back. He paints a picture of a man who loved to party, bragged about his influence over women, and had some pretty unorthodox ideas about spirituality.
One thing that stands out is Rasputin saying he conveyed his force to people through physical touch. That's a pretty creepy image, to be honest.
I know, right? True or not, these stories raise serious questions about Rasputin's character and what his real motives were.
And that brings us back to our Catholic listener. How does a devout Catholic reconcile these allegations with the idea that this guy was a man of God?
That's a complex issue. It gets right to the heart of some fundamental Catholic teachings: sin, virtue, and the whole idea of false prophets. The Church teaches that even people who claim spiritual authority can be corrupted by worldly things. They can fall into sin just like anyone else.
And then there's the question that always comes up with Rasputin. Was he possessed? Was this charismatic figure truly connected to God, or was there something sinister at play?
The Church is always careful about attributing bad things to the devil, but it acknowledges that spiritual warfare is real. Evil forces can tempt and mislead anyone, even religious leaders.
So as Catholics, how do we even approach these questions? How do we separate truth from lies when it comes to someone like Rasputin?
Well, the Church teaches us to judge by fruits. Look at what people do and the consequences of their actions, not just their words and appearances. And in Rasputin's case, it seems like a mixed bag, right?
Absolutely. On one hand, we have stories about his acts of charity, his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, and even a genuine concern for the well-being of the Tsar's son.
Yeah, but then there's the other side. The constant accusations of partying, manipulation, and heresy, those are hard to ignore, especially for someone claiming such a strong spiritual connection.
It's almost like he embodies that whole idea of duality. Light and darkness existing in the same person.
You got it. And that's why the Church gives us tools for discernment. We're supposed to examine the evidence, pray for guidance, and rely on the wisdom of Scripture and tradition when forming our judgments.
So maybe we can't definitively say if Rasputin was evil or possessed, but we can encourage our listener to look at the evidence critically and think about the Church's teachings on sin, virtue, and those who might be false prophets.
Exactly. And maybe by exploring Rasputin's messy life, we can better understand how to find the truth in a world where things aren't always what they seem, and where even people claiming spiritual authority can fall prey to temptation.
This deep dive into Rasputin's alleged immorality is definitely disturbing. But it might also make our listener think about how power dynamics play out in religious communities. It's a reminder about accountability and the need to protect vulnerable people from those who might abuse their positions of authority.
Absolutely. It also highlights how important it is to trust the church's guidance, especially when we encounter people who challenge our understanding of holiness and spiritual authority.
Now let's shift gears and talk about another controversial part of Rasputin's life, his supposed involvement in politics. Iliador claims he had a ton of influence over government appointments, and even affected Russia's foreign policy.
Yeah, Iliador specifically mentions Rasputin bragging about influencing the Tsar's decisions on Stolypin and the Duma.
And of course, there was his very public stance against Russia joining the Balkan War, which was a huge deal back then.
Right. Whether real or exaggerated, this perceived influence is key to understanding why people hated Rasputin. It wasn't just his lifestyle, it was his meddling in government affairs that fueled the controversy.
And this is where the historical context is so important. Remember, Russia in the early 1900s was on the verge of a revolution. There was social unrest, economic hardship, and a growing distrust of the Tsar and his government.
Exactly. And into this chaos walks Rasputin, a figure who seemed to embody all the anxieties and frustrations of the era, his presence at court, his closeness to the Tsarina, and his supposed influence over the Tsar. It all added to the feeling that the old order was crumbling.
He became a symbol of the perceived corruption and dysfunction at the heart of the Russian government.
Exactly. This makes the story even more fascinating, especially for Catholics trying to understand the connection between faith, politics, and personal morality.
Absolutely. It makes you think critically about the role of spiritual authority in a world that's increasingly secular, and the dangers of mixing religious beliefs with political power. Now, let's tackle a tough question for our listener. This devout Catholic wrestling with the seemingly contradictory parts of Rasputin's life. On one hand, there were stories about his charity and spiritual insights, but on the other, there are these constant accusations of immorality, heresy, and manipulation.
That's the thing about Rasputin. He's full of contradictions, and that's why his story is so captivating. He doesn't fit neatly into any category, and that forces us to confront how complicated human nature really is. It's hard to judge historical figures, especially ones shrouded in so much controversy.
So how do we reconcile these seemingly opposing forces? How do we understand a man who seems to embody both saintly and demonic qualities?
Well, maybe the key is recognizing that every human being is capable of both good and evil. We're all flawed, prone to temptation. We can do amazing acts of love and terrible acts of cruelty.
That's a really powerful thought. And while we can't excuse or condone sinful behavior, we can recognize that even people who claim to follow God can stray from the right path.
Exactly. And that's where the Catholic Church's teachings on sin, forgiveness, and redemption come in.
The Church reminds us that even when faced with darkness and depravity, God's mercy is always there for those who seek it.
Absolutely.
So we can't definitively judge Rasputin's soul, but we can encourage our listener to consider his life within the broader context of Catholic teaching. It's a story that reminds us how important discernment is, the need for humility, and the constant struggle between good and evil that we all face.
Right. It also shows how important it is to trust the Church's guidance, especially when dealing with figures who challenge our understanding of holiness and spiritual authority.
All right, let's dive into one of the most interesting parts of Rasputin's story, his alleged healing abilities. Remember, he became famous because of his reputation as a mystic and healer, a miracle worker. And the most famous example is his connection with the Tsar's son, Alexei, who had hemophilia, as we discussed earlier. Iliador talks about times when Rasputin apparently eased Alexei's suffering, giving the royal family a glimmer of hope when they were desperate.
That's right. Even if they're exaggerated, these stories make you wonder about the nature of healing, the power of faith, and the possibility of God intervening in human affairs.
As Catholics, we believe in prayer and the potential for God to work miracles, even when situations seem hopeless.
Absolutely. We see it all the time in Scripture and throughout church history, people being healed through the intercession of saints or through direct divine intervention.
Right, but the Church also encourages us to be discerning about claims of healing, recognizing that some might not be genuine, and some might have a perfectly natural explanation. God can and does work miracles, but we should avoid being superstitious or assuming that everything we can't explain is a supernatural event.
Exactly.
So how do we approach Rasputin's supposed healing abilities?
I think it's about finding a balance between faith and reason. We can acknowledge the testimonies of people who saw these things, even if we don't fully understand them. But we can also be a little skeptical, knowing that people's perceptions aren't always accurate, and there might be things happening that we just don't grasp.
Right. The key is not to jump to conclusions
Mhm.
and to be open to both natural and supernatural explanations.
That's it.
And maybe by exploring these questions, we can better understand God's power, the role faith plays in healing, and the mysteries of human experience.
Absolutely.
Now, let's address something that's especially relevant for our listener, the devout Catholic. How do we reconcile the accusations against Rasputin with the fact that many people saw him as a holy man, even people positions of authority within the Russian Orthodox Church?
That's a good point. It's true that a lot of people in the Russian Orthodox Church embraced Rasputin at first. They saw him as a man of God with special spiritual gifts. Even some bishops and priests were drawn to him because of his charisma and his outward piety.
But that acceptance seems to clash with the allegations of heresy, immorality, and occult involvement.
You're right. This is where we need to remember that even religious leaders are human, and humans make mistakes.
They can be tricked, misled, or even corrupted by power and influence.
Exactly. Unfortunately, church history is full of examples of people who held high positions but strayed from the right path.
We've seen popes make mistakes, bishops abuse their authority, priests give in to temptation.
It happens.
So while we can acknowledge that some people in the Russian Orthodox Church supported Rasputin, we also have to recognize that their judgment might have been clouded.
Clouded by his charisma, his supposed healing powers, or even political pressure.
It's a good reminder that holiness isn't about titles or positions. It's about living a virtuous and humble life, following God's will.
Well said.
And it underscores how important it is to rely on the Catholic Church's teachings and guidance, especially when we encounter figures who challenge our understanding of holiness and spiritual authority.
Yes. The Church, guided by the Holy Spirit, is the protector of truth and the faithful. We also can't forget about the historical and cultural context of the Russian Orthodox Church back then. It was a time when people were really searching for spiritual meaning, fascinated by mysticism. That kind of environment probably made some people more likely to believe Rasputin's claims, and maybe they overlooked his flaws because of it.
That makes sense. It's like he was a symptom of this bigger spiritual crisis, a longing for something more, even if it came from a dubious source.
Right.
It reminds us that even within religion, we need to be careful and discerning, always checking what we see and hear against the Church's teachings.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the question our listener asked, was Rasputin evil, possessed? Those are heavy concepts, and as Catholics, we need to approach them carefully.
It's easy to get caught up in all the sensationalism around Rasputin. The stories, the rumors, the assassinations, all very dramatic. But we have to remember we're talking about a real person here, a complex human being, not just a character in a history book.
Right. And Catholics believe that every human soul is precious, created in God's image. So while we can condemn sinful actions and bad ideologies, we should never judge someone's soul. That's between them and God.
So if we can't definitively answer those big questions about evil and possession,
Yeah.
what can we offer our listeners, especially a devout Catholic trying to make sense of all this?
I think we can offer guidance by looking at Rasputin's life through the lens of Catholic teaching. For example, the Church has a long and complex tradition of dealing with good and evil, temptation, and the possibility of demonic influence.
The Church acknowledges that spiritual warfare is real, that constant battle between good and evil we all face.
Exactly. And it teaches that even people striving for holiness can be tempted. They can make mistakes and even fall into sin.
And that's where discernment comes in. The Church encourages us to look at the results of a person's actions. Do they align with Christ's teachings and the example of the saints?
Right.
And with Rasputin, it seems like we see both good and bad. It reminds us that even within religion, things are always what they seem. And we need to be careful about trusting people, no matter how charismatic or holy they appear.
Absolutely. And for our listener wrestling with those questions about Rasputin, I think the Church's emphasis on forgiveness and redemption is really important.
It's easy to judge Rasputin harshly, to label him as evil or possessed based on what we've read.
It is. But the Church reminds us that we're all sinners who need God's mercy. No one is beyond redemption, and we shouldn't condemn anyone's soul.
It's a powerful message. We can denounce sinful actions, but we should never forget about the possibility of forgiveness and change.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about the political situation in Russia during Rasputin's time. It's impossible to understand his story without considering the social unrest, the political scheming, and the growing discontent with the Tsar's rule.
Right, it was a powder keg ready to explode. And Rasputin, intentionally or not, seems to have played a role in lighting the fuse.
His presence at court, his relationship with the Tsarina, and his supposed influence over political appointments. All of that contributed to the feeling that the government was corrupt and out of touch.
He became the symbol of everything people hated about the old system. And his assassination in 1916, just a year before the Bolshevik Revolution, it's almost like a foreshadowing of the violence and chaos that was coming.
It shows that individuals, even those without much official power, can have a huge impact on history, especially during times of social and political upheaval.
Absolutely.
And for our listener, it raises some important questions about the role of faith in a secular world, the dangers of mixing religious authority with political power, and the importance of seeking justice and working for the common good.
All essential things to think about.
Now, let's talk about Tsarina Alexandra. She plays a crucial role in Rasputin's story. Remember, she was a devout woman, desperate to find a cure for her son Alexei, who had hemophilia.
And Rasputin, with his so-called healing powers, offered her a glimmer of hope in a very dark and uncertain time.
It makes sense that she would hold on to that hope, regardless of the warnings and accusations against him.
It does. It's human nature.
But her devotion to Rasputin, whether out of genuine faith or desperation, seems to have blinded her to his flaws and the danger he represented.
It's possible.
This highlights how important it is to seek wise counsel, to not let our emotions or desires cloud our judgment, especially when it comes to faith and morals.
Absolutely. It's also a reminder that even powerful people we see as strong and unwavering, can be vulnerable to manipulation, especially when they're driven by fear or desperation.
That's a sobering thought. Now let's talk about one of the most controversial and disturbing parts of Rasputin's story, the accusations of sexual misconduct and his association with the Khlists, that mystical sect known for their ecstatic rituals.
Even if some are exaggerated, these accusations are troubling, especially when you consider Catholic teachings. The Church condemns any form of sexual abuse and exploitation, recognizing the dignity of every person and the sanctity of marriage.
And the Khlists, with their focus on ecstatic experiences and unorthodox practices, would definitely have raised red flags for Catholics. The Church has always been wary of groups that claim to have secret knowledge or stray from established doctrine.
It's a reminder that even within religion, we need to be discerning, test the spirits, and make sure that what we're embracing aligns with the Church's teachings.
So while we can't say for sure if all the accusations against Rasputin are true, we can use them as a chance to reflect on how important it is to protect the integrity of our faith and protect ourselves and others from those who might manipulate or exploit us.
That's a good point.
Now let's consider how Rasputin's presence at court affected the already tense political climate in Russia.
Okay.
Remember, the early 1900s was a time of massive social and political unrest in Russia. There was widespread poverty, people were unhappy with the Tsar's rule, and the revolutionary movement was gaining momentum.
Right, and Rasputin's perceived influence over the Tsar and Tsarina only made things worse. He became a symbol of the corruption and dysfunction that people saw in the government.
Exactly. His meddling in political appointments, his opposition to certain policies, and his extravagant lifestyle. All of that alienated the ruling class and emboldened the opposition.
And the Tsar's continued reliance on Rasputin, despite all the evidence and the calls for his removal, made the Tsar look weak and foolish, further eroding public trust in the monarchy.
It's fascinating. We can't say for sure if Rasputin directly caused the fall of the Russian Empire, but it's clear that his presence at court made things much worse and ultimately contributed to the revolution that overthrew the Romanov dynasty.
It's a powerful lesson. Unchecked power, even in a religious context, can have terrible consequences.
It highlights the need for wise leadership, for seeking the common good and listening to the concerns of the people, even when those concerns challenge the people in charge.
Those are important points.
Now, let's dig a little deeper into this web of accusations, rumors, and historical events, and acknowledge that there's still a lot we don't know about Rasputin.
True.
The sources we have, while helpful, are often contradictory, biased, or incomplete.
For example, monk Iliador's account. It's vivid and engaging, but it's clearly influenced by his personal dislike for Rasputin.
And Rasputin's own writings, while they offer some insight into his thoughts, are often self-serving and hard to verify.
That's right.
So, as we try to piece together this puzzle, we need to be careful about making definitive judgments or accepting any one narrative as the absolute truth. We need to look at the evidence critically, consider different perspectives, and admit that we don't know everything.
History is rarely straightforward. It's often messy, unclear, and open to interpretation.
Exactly.
Maybe one of the biggest lessons we can learn from Rasputin's story is the need for humility. even with the best intentions. We can be misled, deceived, or even corrupted by power and influence.
It's a reminder to rely on the Church's guidance, to seek truth through prayer, discernment, and the wisdom of the saints.
Yes.
Okay, let's get back to our listener, the devout Catholic who's trying to understand this enigmatic and controversial figure. What can we offer them? Considering all the conflicting accounts, the scandals, and the unanswered questions.
I think the most important takeaway is that we need to be vigilant and discerning, even within religion. Not everyone who claims to speak for God is actually doing so. And even people who start with good intentions can go astray.
It's a good reminder to always compare what we see and hear with the Church's teachings, to rely on Scripture and tradition, and to seek guidance from Church leaders.
The Catholic Church, with its long history and deep understanding of human nature, gives us the tools to navigate these complex situations, to separate truth from lies, and to protect our faith.
It also reminds us that while we should be careful about judging someone's soul, we can and should condemn sinful actions and harmful beliefs.
Exactly. And in Rasputin's case, that means acknowledging the harm he caused, the pain he inflicted on others, and the damage he did to the Church's reputation.
Right. So while we can't say for sure whether he was evil or possessed, we can learn from his story and use it to reflect on our own beliefs and choices and our responsibility to live virtuous and moral lives.
Absolutely.
Now, let's shift our focus to Tsarina Alexandra and her role in Rasputin's rise to power.
Okay, remember, Alexandra was a devout woman, completely devoted to her family and desperate to find a cure for her son Alexei, who had hemophilia.
And Rasputin, with his claims of being a healer and his apparent ability to ease Alexei's suffering. He gave her hope when she was surrounded by darkness and anxiety.
From a human perspective, it's understandable why she would cling to that hope, even when there was evidence that Rasputin might not be who he said he was.
It is. Her devotion to him, whether out of faith or desperation, seems to have blinded her to his faults and the danger he posed.
It's a good reminder that even powerful people we see as strong and unshakable, can be manipulated.
Especially when they're motivated by fear or desperation.
It's important to seek wise counsel, to rely on the Church's guidance, and to avoid putting blind faith in individuals who claim to have special powers or a connection to God.
Absolutely.
Alexandra's trust in Rasputin, along with her influence over the Tsar, undoubtedly helped him gain power. It gave him access to important people, allowed him to influence political appointments, and even affected Russia's foreign policy. While we can't know for sure if Alexandra was fully aware of Rasputin's manipulations, or the truth behind the accusations against him, her unwavering support definitely allowed him to act without much consequence.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding people in authority accountable for their actions.
It also reminds us that even in a religious context, blind faith can be dangerous. True devotion to God requires discernment, critical thinking, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths.
Now, let's talk about the impact Rasputin had on the already unstable political situation in Russia.
Okay.
The early 1900s in Russia was a time of massive social and political upheaval.
There was widespread poverty, growing dissatisfaction with the Tsar's rule, and the revolutionary movement was gaining strength.
And Rasputin, with his strong influence over the Tsar and Tsarina, became a target of criticism. His very presence at court was seen as a symbol of the corruption and the dysfunction in the government.
Exactly.
His alleged interference in political appointments, his opposition to certain policies, and his extravagant lifestyle. All of that fueled the anger and frustration among the Russian people.
And the Tsar's continued support of Rasputin, despite the evidence against him and the demands for his removal, was seen as a sign of weakness and bad judgment, which further eroded public confidence in the monarchy.
So, while we can't say definitively that Rasputin was solely responsible for the fall of the Russian Empire, we can see how his presence at court added fuel to the fire and ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty.
It's a stark reminder of how quickly things can fall apart, how seemingly insignificant people can have a huge impact on history, and how crucial it is for leaders to listen to their people and govern wisely and honestly.
Absolutely.
Now let's step back and consider the bigger picture. Russia in the early 1900s was going through a period of major change.
The old ways, with their rigid social classes and absolute monarchy, were under immense pressure.
People were becoming more aware of social injustice. They wanted more political freedom, and they were questioning traditional values and beliefs.
It was a time of intense intellectual activity, with new ideas about science, philosophy, and politics challenging the status quo.
And into this turbulent environment comes Rasputin, a figure who represents both the excitement and danger of this era of change.
He was a walking contradiction, a mix of piety and depravity, charisma and cunning, spiritual insight and worldly ambition.
His story reflects the anxieties, hopes, and uncertainties of a society on the verge of transformation.
And it serves as a reminder that even during times of great upheaval, we need to hold on to our faith, rely on the Church's guidance, and strive to live virtuous and moral lives.
Absolutely.
Now, let's examine the specific accusations against Rasputin, particularly those about his behavior and beliefs.
Monk Iliador's account is full of vivid, often scandalous anecdotes that paint a picture of a man who loved excess and used his spiritual authority for his own benefit.
He talks about Rasputin bragging about his influence over women, engaging in strange religious practices, and even participating in occult rituals.
That's right.
These accusations, even if some are exaggerated or motivated by personal dislike, severely damaged Rasputin's reputation and ultimately contributed to his downfall.
They make us question the nature of power, the possibility of corruption within religious communities, and the importance of separating truth from lies.
One of the most persistent and troubling accusations is about Rasputin's sexual impropriety.
Iliador describes incidents where Rasputin behaved inappropriately with women, often using his spiritual authority to pressure them.
These allegations are especially concerning when you consider Catholic teaching, which stresses the dignity of each person, the sacredness of marriage, and the importance of respecting boundaries.
The Church condemns sexual abuse and exploitation in any form, recognizing that such actions violate God's law and cause serious harm.
While we can't prove every accusation against Rasputin, the fact that there are so many suggests that his behavior was at least very problematic.
That's a fair assessment.
It's a reminder that positions of power can be abused, even within religion, and we must always protect the vulnerable from those who might exploit them.
Absolutely.
Another aspect of Rasputin's life that raised red flags, even among his early supporters, was his connection to the Klists.
Right. The Klists were known for their ecstatic rituals, which often involved dancing, chanting, and self-flagellation.
From a Catholic perspective, those practices would probably be considered heretical, straying from established doctrine and potentially harmful.
The Church has always been cautious about groups claiming to have special or secret knowledge, especially when those claims involve unusual practices that could lead people astray.
And Rasputin's alleged involvement with the Klists, along with his own strange behavior, made people suspect he was promoting heretical beliefs,
which further damaged his reputation and contributed to the growing opposition to his influence within the Russian Orthodox Church.
It reminds us that even in a religious context, we need to be discerning and carefully examine teachings and practices to make sure they align with Church doctrine and promote genuine holiness.
Absolutely.
Now, besides the accusations of sexual misconduct and heresy, Rasputin was also accused of dabbling in the occult.
Iliador describes Rasputin performing rituals, making prophecies, and claiming to have supernatural powers.
Even if exaggerated, these accusations tap into a deep-seated fear of the unknown, the power of darkness, and the potential for manipulation through occult practices.
Right.
The Catholic Church has always warned against the dangers of the occult, recognizing that it can open the door to evil and lead people away from God.
It's true.
While we can't say for sure if Rasputin actually practiced the occult, the accusations themselves reflect the anxieties and spiritual uncertainties of the time.
It was a society grappling with huge changes,
facing the decline of traditional beliefs, and searching for answers in the midst of growing social and political turmoil.
And in times of uncertainty, people are often drawn to those who offer a sense of certainty, a connection to the spiritual realm or the promise of power.
Which makes it even more important to stay grounded in the Church's teachings, to seek truth through prayer, discernment, and the sacraments, rather than turning to potentially dangerous or deceptive practices.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to the political intrigue surrounding Rasputin and his alleged influence over the Tsar and Tsarina.
Okay.
Russia in the early 1900s was a hotbed of political maneuvering, with different groups vying for power and influence.
It was.
Tsar Nicholas II was seen by many as a weak and indecisive leader, struggling to maintain control in the face of social unrest and political opposition.
And Tsarina Alexandra, a devout woman, was perceived as being under Rasputin's sway, relying on him for spiritual guidance and for healing her son Alexei.
This created a power vacuum that Rasputin, with his charisma and perceived connection to God, was able to exploit.
Yes, he was a master manipulator.
Iliador's account is full of examples of Rasputin supposedly influencing political appointments, interfering in government affairs, and even shaping Russia's foreign policy.
He describes Rasputin bragging about his ability to control the Tsar and Tsarina, using his influence for his own game and to benefit his supporters.
These accusations, even if exaggerated, show how dangerous unchecked power can be, especially when it's in the hands of someone claiming to have a direct line to God.
And it highlights how vulnerable leaders can be to manipulation and undue influence, especially when facing pressure from within and outside.
Rasputin's perceived political power, whether real or not, became a symbol of the corruption and dysfunction that many saw in the Russian Empire.
Right. It fueled resentment towards the monarchy, empowered the opposition, and ultimately helped pave the way for the revolution that overthrew the Romanovs.
We can't say for sure how much Rasputin actually controlled the government, but we can see how his involvement in politics made things worse, and ultimately contributed to the downfall of the Russian Empire.
It's a warning about the dangers of mixing spiritual authority with political power. A reminder that even in a seemingly religious context, political maneuvering and the pursuit of power can have disastrous consequences.
Now, let's bring it back to our listener, the devout Catholic, trying to understand this complex and controversial figure.
We've explored the accusations, rumors, his supposed influence over the Tsar and Tsarina, and the turbulent historical context he lived in.
It's clear that Rasputin was full of contradictions, a mix of good and bad. He showed compassion at times, but he also engaged in behavior that Catholics would consider sinful and harmful.
They did.
So, how do we reconcile these seemingly opposite sides of him? How do we judge a man who seems to embody both holiness and evil?
It's tempting to try and put him in a neat category, to label him as either a saint or a villain.
Right.
But the truth is much more complicated. Rasputin was a complex person, shaped by his background, experiences, and the world around him.
As Catholics, we're called to approach his story with discernment and compassion. We can condemn his bad actions, but we shouldn't judge his soul.
That's for God to decide.
The Church, with its long history of dealing with the complexities of human nature, offers a way to understand sin, forgiveness, and redemption.
It reminds us that we're all sinners who need God's mercy, and that none of us are beyond the reach of his grace.
So, while we can't say for sure if Rasputin was evil or possessed, we can learn from his story and use it as a chance to reflect on our own beliefs and choices, and our responsibility to live moral and virtuous lives.
Absolutely.
We can also learn from the mistakes of those who came before us, recognizing the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of discerning truth from lies, and the need to hold on to the Church's teachings.
All vital lessons.
Now let's explore one of the most intriguing parts of Rasputin's story, his supposed healing abilities.
Wow.
Remember, he became famous because of his reputation as a mystic and healer, someone who could seemingly perform miracles.
And the most famous example is his connection with the Tsar's son, Alexei, who had hemophilia, as we mentioned. Iliador talks about instances where Rasputin seemed to ease Alexei's suffering, giving the royal family a glimmer of hope when they were desperate. Even if exaggerated, these accounts make you wonder about the nature of healing, the power of faith, and whether God intervenes in human affairs.
As Catholics, we believe in prayer and that God can work miracles, even in the most difficult situations.
We do. We see examples throughout Scripture and church history, people being healed through the intercession of saints or through direct divine intervention.
But the Church also tells us to be discerning about claims of healing. Not all claims are genuine, and some might have natural explanations. While God can and does work miracles, we should avoid being superstitious or assuming that everything we can't explain is supernatural.
I agree.
So how do we make sense of Rasputin's supposed healing abilities?
It's about finding a balance between faith and reason. We can acknowledge the people who witnessed these events, even if we can't fully explain them, but we can also be a little skeptical, knowing that human perception isn't perfect, and there might be factors at play that we don't fully understand.
So the key is to avoid jumping to conclusions.
Yeah.
And to be open to both natural and supernatural explanations. Maybe by exploring these questions, we can deepen our own understanding of God's power and the role of faith in healing and the mysteries of the human experience.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, for our listener, the devout Catholic, how do we reconcile the accusations against Rasputin with the fact that he was often seen as a holy man, even by some in the Russian Orthodox Church?
It's true that Rasputin was initially embraced by many in the Russian Orthodox Church. He was seen as a man of God with special gifts. Even some bishops and priests were drawn to his charisma and outward piety.
But that acceptance seems to clash with the accusations of heresy, immorality, and occult involvement.
It does. But we need to remember that even religious leaders are human and make mistakes.
They can be fooled, misled, or corrupted by power and influence.
Sadly, church history is full of examples of people in high positions who strayed from the right path.
We've seen popes make mistakes, bishops abuse their authority, priests give in to temptation.
It's a reminder that holiness isn't about titles or positions. It's about living a virtuous and humble life in line with God's will.
So, while some in the Russian Orthodox Church supported Rasputin, we have to consider that their judgment might have been clouded.
Clouded by his charisma, his supposed healing abilities, or even political pressure.
It's a good reminder that true holiness is about how you live your life, not about titles or positions of authority.
And it underscores the importance of relying on the Catholic Church's teachings and guidance, especially when encountering figures who challenge our understanding of holiness and spiritual authority.
The Church, guided by the Holy Spirit, is the protector of truth and the faithful. It's amazing how Rasputin managed to grab everyone's attention in Russia, for good or bad. And like we've been talking about, his story brings up all these big questions about faith, power, and what it means to be human. But before we wrap up, we got to talk about Rasputin's assassination in 1916.
Oh yeah, his death was just as dramatic and controversial as his life. A bunch of nobles decided he was a threat to Russia and plotted to kill him.
The whole thing sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does. Poison cakes, multiple gunshots, and then they dumped his body in a freezing river.
Wow, that's a brutal end. It shows how much fear and hatred he inspired in his enemies. They were convinced that killing him was the only way to save Russia.
It makes you think about the lengths people will go to when they believe they're doing the right thing. It raises questions about violence, even when it seems like it's for a good cause.
And it's interesting how Rasputin continued to fascinate people even after he died. His assassination just added to the mystery surrounding him.
Absolutely. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder about the dangers of unchecked power, the appeal of charisma, and how even the most powerful empires can crumble.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I keep thinking about our listener's question. How should a devout Catholic view Rasputin?
It's a tough one. Rasputin was full of contradictions. He could be compassionate and incredibly cruel.
We've looked at all the evidence, and it's not easy to judge him. We've seen accounts of his piety, his charity, his spiritual insights, but then there are those disturbing accusations, the rumors about his wild behavior, manipulation, and heresy.
It would be easy to label him as a saint or a sinner.
Right.
But he doesn't fit neatly into either category. He was a complex person living in a complex time.
And as Catholics, we need to approach his story with both discernment and compassion. We can condemn his sins, but we shouldn't judge his soul.
That's up to God.
The Church helps us understand the complicated nature of humanity, sin, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption.
It reminds us that we're all flawed, capable of both good and evil, and that no one is beyond God's mercy.
So while we can't say for sure whether Rasputin was evil or possessed, we can use his story as a mirror to reflect on our own beliefs, choices, and how we live our lives.
We can also learn from the mistakes of those who came before us, recognize the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of finding truth, and hold on to the teachings of the Church. And one last thought to ponder. What if Rasputin had never met the Tsar and Tsarina? What if his story had played out somewhere else, outside of the royal court? Would he have been forgotten, or would he have found other ways to make his mark on history?
It's a question that makes you think about how circumstances shape our lives and the complex relationship between our choices and the forces of history.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Grigory Rasputin. We hope it made you question what you thought you knew, sparked your curiosity, and maybe even helped you understand your own faith better.
And like always, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop searching for the truth.